Well, now we are on air. My name is Sławomir Dębski. I'm director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and I would like to welcome all of you to our next conversation related to this book, Europe, Whole and Free, Vision and Reality. I had an honor to co-edit it with Dan Hamilton, who is with us today. Dan is already known for our permanent watchers of this panel, Austrian Marshall Foundation professor at the Johns Hopkins University, Paul Nees School of Advanced International Studies, Washington, D.C. He's also a president of Transatlantic Leadership Network, a group of politicians and experts, those who are crossing fingers for transatlantic relations. And now Dan is Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Busch Academy in Berlin. So thank you, Dan, that you found time to be with us again. And today our special guest is Vladimir Kara-Murza, Russian activist, democratic leader, journalist, a filmmaker, a friend of Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated in February 2015, just a few steps from the Kremlin. And from that time, Vladimir made a lot of effort to commemorate Boris Nemtsov across the world. He's, and successfully, I have to say that with great success. So Vladimir, thank you very much that you joined us today. And of course, the main reason why we wanted to have you during this conversation, is your piece you contributed to our book, Europe, Whole and Free, in which you generally outline the path Russia has gone from 1989 to the contemporary times and to the Putin's era. Let me explain why we decided to invite you to this project. When President of the United States, George H. Bush, laid down his great vision of Europe, whole and free, you were only 8 years old, I believe.
That's correct.
So actually, this message was not drafted for you, or not directly for you, but rather for your father, I would say, who was already a known liberal Russian activist, historian, critic of Brezhnev era and Brezhnev regime, and supporter of perestroika and democratic change in Russia. So one may say that this Bush vision was addressed to the future Russians, was addressed, of course, to those who are active in changing the Soviet Union, including your father, but also to the next generation of Russians. So that means you as well. And you wrote in your piece that there is that we cannot think about fulfilling this George H. Bush vision of Europe whole and free unless there is a democratic government in Russia and there is democratic change. Could you explain to us, why do you think so? Why we cannot realistically think about current Russia as a contributor to democratic vision of George H. Bush.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dubsky. Thank you, Professor Hamilton. It is an honor to join you in this virtual format, and I look forward to the day when we're finally all able to go back to real work, real meetings, and real events. And thank you so much for the Polish Institute of International Affairs for hosting our discussion today. And just on a little aside note, if I may, Dr. Debski, you're in Warsaw now, correct?
Yes.
So I just want to say on behalf of so many of my friends and colleagues in the Russian democratic movement, how envious we were to see a few days ago, just 2 days ago, a real election in your country with a real vote count and such a close result between the two candidates. We haven't had anything approaching a real electoral competition in Russia for 20 years now. So we have an entire generation that grew up not even knowing what a real democratic competitive election looks like. It's a revolutionary concept for Russia today that the result of an election can actually be determined by how people vote, not by how some official in some office or in some room in the Kremlin or on Staraya Ploshchad decides. So I just wanted to say this at the outset, and also thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this volume that you published. It's an extremely important, I believe, document of reference for a long time to come. So I'm honored to be a part of it. Thank you so much. Yes, we were talking, of course, about the last year was the 30th anniversary of the Mainz speech. That was the kind of the immediate reason for your publication. And I think on the one hand, it's important to say what an astonishing progress has been made since the Mainz speech in terms of, trying to reach that goal of a Europe whole and free. And I don't think that even in their wildest dreams, the people, the speechwriters, the national security advisors, the members of the team of President George H.W. Bush could even imagine that they would be able, or not they, but that Europe would be able to take such important strides in this direction. But as I mentioned in a piece that you referenced in your volume, I think it's also important to note that the 30th anniversary of the Mainz speech was also a sad one, because although there has been important progress made, Europe is still far from being whole, free, and at peace, as was the kind of cornerstone of that speech. Because, of course, Europe can only, and this is stating the obvious, but I think sometimes it is important to restate the obvious things just to kind of keep us in the basics. Europe can only be whole, free, and at peace when two largest countries in Europe, which are Russia and Ukraine, are part of that reality. And unfortunately, we are still far away from achieving that. Ukraine is closer, of course, thanks to the strides and changes that they have been making in the last few years, but still obviously not there, not by a long shot. And Russia, my country, under the regime of Vladimir Putin in the past 20 years, has been going in the exact opposite direction. It's important to say, and I say this in my piece as well, that for the first few years, for the better part of the 1990s, the movement towards that, Europe whole, free, and in peace was mutual, was for everybody, and Russia was going in the same direction as our neighbors in Eastern and Central Europe. And of course, when we speak about all of this, it's important also to state how important that concept of Europe was and is and will be, I think, to the notion of democratic transformation in our part of the world. Because I cannot say it better than Václav Havel did when he spoke, when he gave his address to the joint session of the United States Congress, when he said that for his country, for then still Czechoslovakia, this project of democratization was above all a return to Europe. This is his quote. So this post-communist transformation in Eastern and Central European states, as I don't need to tell you in Poland, was not only about independent media and pluralistic elections and genuine parliament and political competition and everything that we associate with a liberal democratic system, but it was as importantly about reinstatement of the status of these countries as fully European, quote unquote. Of course, a European anyway, but I mean this in a political sense, in a geopolitical sense. And so that prospect of genuine Euro-Atlantic integration was an important incentive, I think, for a lot of countries in Eastern and Central European region on their successful road to democracy. Now, when we speak about Russia, I do not in any way want to sound as if I'm trying to blame the West for what happened in Russia and the reversal of our democratic process that we've been seeing after the year 2000, after Vladimir Putin came to power. And I say this in my piece too, as you know, the main blame, of course, lies on the Russian side. We said A, but we never said B. We never kind of fully overcame and moved on and came to terms with, frankly, with the Soviet communist past, as was done in other countries in Eastern and Central Europe. Yes, the communist regime was overthrown in the democratic revolution in August of 1991, but we never had full lustrations, for example, as some other countries in Central Europe did. We never had a full opening of the archives, as many other countries, including your own Dr. Nevsky, did. We've never had a full and public reckoning of the fact, or with the fact, that the Soviet communist regime had been a criminal system, criminal above all towards its own people. We never had that public recognition. And so, you know, as Vladimir Bukovsky, who was a prominent Soviet-era dissident, warned the Russian government at the time in the early 1990s, it's like with a wounded beast. If you don't finish it off, it will attack you. And so sure enough, we saw that just 8 years. What is 8 years in history? It's nothing. It's a second. Just 8 years after the democratic revolution of August 1991, in December of 1999, we had an office of the Soviet KGB come to power in Russia and still remain there to this day, something that was inconceivable to the generation of my father, whom you referenced, who was, for all 3 days and 3 nights of August 1991, was by the Moscow White House at the barricades, along with his friends and colleagues, defending democracy and defending freedom. So this is just to say straight away that, of course, absolutely the lion's share of the blame for what is happening in Russia today lies internally with us. But there is an important international component. And I write about it in my piece as well. And I think it's important to speak about this component, not only as a lesson from history, which, you know, I'm a historian by training, so I think it's important to speak about lessons of history, even for their own sake. But it's also very importantly in practical terms for the next time Russia has a window of opportunity to move in the direction of a democratic transition, which will come. You know, history hasn't been too kind to my country, but it has given us several opportunities for democratic change. In the early 20th century, in the late 20th century, I've absolutely no doubt there will be another one. And it's, I think, important not only for us in Russia to be prepared for that next window, but for our friends and partners in the West, and above all, in the rest of Europe too. And I think the main mistake that many of our, I should say the previous generation now of Western policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic made in the 1990s, is that they were not prepared to offer Russia that return to Europe to the same extent that they were prepared to offer Czechoslovakia, then the Czech Republic, Poland, and other former communist countries. You know, on the 20th of December 1991, I referenced this fact in my piece. President Boris Yeltsin, this was before the Soviet Union was even formally dissolved, 5 days before. President Boris Yeltsin wrote a letter to NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner, raising the question of future membership of Russia in NATO, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And as I was working on this piece for your volume, I went to the Library of Congress to look through some of the old issues of, you know, newspapers, American newspapers in the case from those days. And I found an astonishing quote in the New York Times, which I included in my piece. And it said that NATO officials and NATO leaders were so taken aback by this proposition from President Yeltsin that they could not offer a coherent response. This was a phrase. Well, I think policymakers should look a couple of steps ahead. And I think that, you know, again, next time that window of opportunity comes, I hope there is a coherent response, because the fact that there wasn't one in the early 1990s, by the way, there was never any response to that letter by President Yeltsin. And another example I give is that according to the provisions of the Treaty of Maastricht, any European country has an opportunity or the right to become a member of the European Union. The Treaty of Maastricht came into force in 1992, so about the time that we're speaking about now. And yet, Boris Yeltsin's Russia, the democratic Russia, was not offered this even as a distant theoretical possibility. There wasn't even any talk of this. And I think, again, not to blame outside forces, because that would have just been too easy, and also that would not be correct. But there is this important component that I think that profoundly important incentive of integrating and moving fully into Europe that many of our neighbors and friends had in the 1990s, and that helped them, or helped you, I should say, move into that direction. We did not have that incentive. And I think it is very important that the next time Russia has a window of opportunity for a democratic transition, not only that we on the Russian side, that Russian society learns those failed lessons of the 1990s, and this time fully overcome any authoritarian tendencies or any authoritarian legacies. But I think it's also very important for our friends and neighbors on the European continent to be ready to open their arms and to fully welcome that future democratic Russia as one of their own.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this initial comment. I would have some questions to you, but before that, I would like to ask Dan about this President Bush message of 1989, because that was, that was in this address, in this message, there was also invitation. First of all, to Mikhail Gorbachev to join this great vision, to build this great, or to implement this great vision of Europe whole and free together, to overcome the past of divisions, iron curtain in Europe. My question to you, because in 90s you were involved in implementing somehow this vision in Clinton administration, as a you were one of these key figures who tried to build bridges between America and Europe in that time. So how much in your mind were the Russians, not only the leaders, but the Russian society? Because this question leads me to another one. Did we miss something in this conceptualization of our political vision in the beginning of 90s? Didn't we miss the Russian society in our thinking? How do you think about that?
Thank you, Slavek. It's good to be with you all. I appreciate the comments. Well, I think on the US side, at least at that time, the concern was, it's hard to remember these things. The concern at the time was that we were facing dissolution of two empires, if you want to put it that way, the Soviet Union and the Yugoslav Empire, and that 20 new countries had appeared on the European map within just a space of a couple of years. And the question was then, what about the instabilities that were very obvious that were being generated by these sudden changes? The concern at the time was not as much about integrating this or that country, it is whether those countries will even continue. There was no assurance that when the Soviet Union dissolved, that Russia, as currently constituted, in fact, would have continued as the state it is now. Remember all sorts of other type of separatist movements going on, lots of instabilities, and then the whole Yugoslav issue, which preoccupied so many people in the Clinton administration, which you could argue we got really badly wrong at the beginning. And it was only because we re-engaged and tried to work it out that somehow we got the Balkans on some track. It's still very difficult there. But compared to that disaster, in which there were problems also with Russia, managing the transition with Yeltsin's Russia was much more of a success, one could argue, given these other preoccupations. The challenge there was whether Yeltsin would make it. I think if you read President Clinton's memoirs and you go to the archives now that are open, I should say we also have a book on our website about the end of the Cold War and another on 20 years of NATO enlargement, in which many of the protagonists at that time actually talk about their considerations, including Strobe Talbot, who at that time was sort of the main interlocutor, if you will, with Russian colleagues about how to manage this. And it was, I think, understood more as a process in which the space of Europe where sort of war does not happen, where peace and prosperity, market economies prevail, can gradually expand. But as my former boss, Richard Holbrooke, said, it's not like picking up the keys to the country club. There actually were conditions to meet and things, and you had to build a consensus among the prevailing members that this would be a good thing. As Vladimir said, sometimes that meant Russia didn't get the answer it wanted, but also because there were really questions about the conditions. These were real things. Our Polish friends know that for a fact. There were very high bars to jump, if you will, to become part of this. I think the other consideration was we can't get this wrong. So the consideration was you take in first a small group of countries to show that this expansion, this opening up of our institutions to countries across the continent would work and be sustained. And then you take others in as they are ready and able. And that never excluded Russia. The door was always open. I had many fights with, frankly, some European colleagues about whether you say where Europe ends and where you say Russia would never be able to belong. And we had to basically say, what does that mean? That means we would be setting up the wall, a couple thousand kilometers eastward. We would be the ones that created the dividing lines, and that was not going to be what we could do. But we understood it as a process of dynamic process. And the Clinton administration ran out of time to continue on that. And then the Bush administration came in, and 9/11 happened in the United States. And it's completely skewed much of US foreign policy in a very fundamentally different direction. We could go into this. Last time on this podcast, we did this with Andrei Kortunov a bit, so I won't go into that. I want to come back to more the point about the conditions and what Vladimir said about the domestic situation in Russia. Because what we have said, and I think Vladimir, I would think you would agree that the path of Russia to Europe is through Russian society. And that's what Slavik was just asking. And my question to you would be, how do you think Russia can define, is it possible that Russia could define its greatness? It is a great society, a great country, but it tends to define its greatness through power politics. Is there a way it could define its greatness by paying attention to its people, diversifying its economy, paying attention to human rights and rule of law, that there is a narrative about Russian greatness that goes in this direction? That to me would be a way to open up the dialogue further. I realize it's probably difficult now, but I'd be interested at least to hear your take on that notion.
So I would like to join this question, or to follow this question, and pose the following one. There is a assessment or thinking both in Russia, which I believe it is supported by the Kremlin and official propaganda, but also outside of Russia. For this kind of thinking is harbored by those who are not really they don't want to learn about Russia much or don't know Russia well. So the thinking is that Russia is doomed to be an authoritarian state, either tsars or dictators, but there is no chance that Russia may one day become a democratic country. So what's your response to that? I think this both questions, Dan's and mine, goes more or less in the same line.
Thank you so much for both questions. And if I could address Professor Hamilton's point first, I think it's a fundamental one. I believe, and I know so do many of my friends and colleagues in the Russian democratic movement, that the greatness of a country is not determined by the number of nuclear missiles it has pointing at someone else, but by the quality and standard of living of its citizens, by the quality of education, by the opportunities its citizens have, by, for example, their citizens' ability to freely travel around the world, to give their children, the next generation, a better standard of living that they had. For us, these are the real factors of greatness of a nation, without quotation marks. Not these old 19th century zero-sum notions, whatever we want to call them. I looked recently, a few months ago, there was this annual index of universities that I think the Times of London publishes every year. And out of 500 top universities in Europe, there are only 3 universities from Russia. So only 3 Russian universities made it into the 500 top European universities. And to me, I mean, it's shameful and it's tragic. And, one of the things our country was always celebrated for is the quality of the education. And this is, I think, is one of the results of 2 decades of this kleptocratic authoritarian rule that we've had under Vladimir Putin. You know, we have a massive brain drain from our country, as everybody knows well, and this is one of the results of it. It's things like this that should be, you know, when we have 80 universities or 100 universities out of 500 in Europe from Russia, this for me is one of the real signs of greatness, and so on and so forth. I mean, we can go for a long time about this, but I think this is actually one of the most fundamental differences in philosophy and outlook between the Democrats in Russia and the current political regime. In one of recent interviews, Alexei Navalny, who's the most prominent opposition politician in Russia today, he said, and I think it's a really concise way of expressing this philosophy. He said, you know, our ambition is for Russia to become just a normal modern European country. And there's so much in that one phrase. And I think the point that Professor Hamilton made, that goes right into it. And it's one of the biggest differences between us and the Kremlin. I remember when in one of his final interviews before he was killed, Boris Nemtsov was asked, what are the biggest differences between you and you know, and Putin and people behind the Kremlin? And he said, he answered very simply as well. And for people, especially for Europeans, this will be a very, very clear and understandable answer. He said, we believe that Russia is a European country and people who are in the Kremlin don't. And there's so much of this. It's not just, as I don't need to tell you, you know, Europe is not just a geographical concept. In my view, it's above all not a geographical concept. I mean, if even I was fascinated, Professor Hamilton, by what you just said, referencing to some Western European policymakers who wanted to kind of draw this line, right? Just put it 2,000 kilometers east, but still have that new Berlin Wall. It's not just from some people in the West; it's also from people in the Kremlin. I mean, they had this white paper, policy white paper, recently, a few years ago, published by Putin's Ministry of Culture, which was entitled "Russia is not Europe." This was the official name. So trying to wipe out, you know, hundreds of years of history and culture and civilization as we know it, and all the rest of it. So there's kind of these matching forces on both sides. And I think they're, of course, fundamentally wrong. I mean, needless to say, geographically, Russia is the largest country in Europe, but that's not the most important thing here. I think it's since at least the late 17th century, Russia's been an integral part of European history, European politics, European culture. And even if we talk about political things, and this I'm transitioning to the question Dr. Debsky asked about this, and I know, knowing your views, I know that you asked this as a provocative question. I'm grateful to you for asking it, because I think one of the most insulting and offensive stereotypes that we Russians sometimes hear from some Westerners, not all by any means, but from some Westerners, is that, and by the way, it's very often people who want to have good relations with Putin, who want to try to deal with Putin, and they need some sort of a rational explanation for their efforts to appease a corrupt dictatorship. And, you know, they can't just say, you know, we'll like to appease a corrupt dictatorship. That doesn't sound good. So they come up with this false and offensive stereotype that, oh, these Russians can't do any better. This is the best they can do. They can't live with democracy. They're doomed to be, you know, authoritarians. They doomed to live under, you know, they like a strong hand. That's the one I probably hate hearing most. You know, try it out, those who say this. But first of all, as I said, it is an insulting and offensive stereotype as a Russian. But more importantly, for the purposes of our conversation, and here I'm speaking as a historian, not as a political activist, it is also not true. Because if we look at the facts as opposed to the stereotypes, we'll see that, for example, if we look at the past century or so of Russian history, we'll see that every time that Russian society, the Russian people, had a chance to freely choose in a democratic election between an authoritarian path and a democratic path, they always chose a democratic path. 1906, the first election to the Russian State Duma, first ever parliamentary election in the history of Russia, won by the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Cadets, the leading liberal reformist party of the time. Supporters of Tsarist autocracy, who had all the levers of government, did not win a single seat, zero. This was 1906. Of course, 1917, November of 1917, the election to the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, which was held after the Bolsheviks seized power by use of force, and they lost that election massively. They lost it to the SRs, which was a party also left-wing economically, but politically supporters of a parliamentary democratic republic, not dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, as we know, that assembly was disbanded by force. And something that is within my own living memory. The first ever direct election for head of state in a 1,000-year history of Russia, the presidential election of June 1991. When Boris Yeltsin, who was the candidate of the democratic forces, of the democratic opposition, defeated the candidate of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, still ruling at that time, by 57% to 17%. Those are the facts. Those are not the stereotypes. And so those claims that, Russians are somehow, not used to democracy on our account. This has been said throughout history. This has been said about Spain. This has been said about Germany. This has been said about many countries in Europe. And of course, we all know now how bogus and how untrue that is. It's a feeble pretext that is usually used by people who want to rationalize and somehow justify their attempts to have close relations with the Kremlin dictatorship. And it's just simply not borne out by the facts.
Thank you very much. That, to the Polish ears, it sounds very convincing. That's the same thinking was, or the same message to the opposition, the members of the Polish opposition on the communism times was sent by the communist government in Poland. They claim that actually Poland squeezed between Germany and Soviet Union, between this iron, in the shadow of Iron Curtain, cannot dream about independence and the future as a democratic free country. So I think that's the continuous message of authoritarian leadership in the past and in the present, that there is no alternative. That you could, the only thing you can have, it's us. Those who are actually in power. So I like, and I'm 100% on your side, and I really believe that Russia indeed can one day become a part of European democratic family. The thing is that the level of aspiration and determination of Russian people is of matter in this case. And let me refer once again to the Polish case. In 1990, the first Polish envoy to European communities handed his credential, I think, beginning of 1990. And he had a conversation with Jacques Delors in that time. So after this ceremony, there was a brief conversation between them, and Jacques Delors asked simply the question, what now? What they are going to do, you Poles? And Jan Kołakowski, without any official instruction, responded, we are going to join European communities. Because that was quite natural. That was bipartisan aim. All Poles wanted to, as you said in your paper, come back to Europe. They wanted to become a part of it. And I think that this leads me to the following question, both to Dan and you. Maybe first, Dan, what the West can do to enhance determination of the Russians to think like that one day they would have a chance to become a full-fledged member of democratic family, both in Europe and transatlantic area. Dan.
Well, I think your question, it's hard to exclude how you have to respond to the current regime as opposed to just Russian society. I think one has to think of it together. And so let me try out my view and see if Vladimir agrees with me. It seems to me we're confronted with a Russia currently that, at some point didn't buy any longer into this notion that there would be this progressive integration and, joint modernization and partnership. We can argue about when that happened, but I think many in Europe still think that you can have this partnership or modernization of which Putin and company can sort of kind of come back to the West, and that somehow Russia got lost somehow along the way. My view is I think Mr. Putin has delivered a fairly clear message that is hard power matters. You can change borders by force in Europe today and get away with it. And Russia's not lost in transition. It has it is going a different way under Vladimir Putin. So I think that's a fundamental challenge to the prevailing paradigm we had had, which means that we have to consider now Russia in a different light. I would argue one has to think of sort of three strands. One is you have to hold the Russian regime accountable when it violates basic precepts of international law or international order. Foremost, one sees that in Ukraine and many other countries as well. And you have to simply, hold them accountable to that. The second, though, is to look for, because of the tensions that we have with each other, and all of the framework of the Cold War, when it was a global Cold War, we still had ways to talk to each other and to mitigate disaster through different kinds of mechanisms, whether it's armed control, confidence building measures, whatever it was. All of that has eroded. We really have nothing left of that system except the New START, and that could also, be canceled. And so it seems to me we have a mutual interest to look for areas where we can at least look to avoid miscalculation, accident, things that really will go badly for all of us if we don't pay attention. And right now, we're not having that conversation. That would be all with the regime because it's simply who you have to deal with. But the third strand is the one I think that has the most promise, potentially, and the most dynamism. And that would be to, reach out to Russians, not Russia, the regime, but Russians, Russian society, to try to build all the kinds of exchanges and people-to-people contacts and connections that we possibly can, so that all the things that Vladimir had said could actually happen. Because in the end, that's the societal basis for all of everything else. When Václav Havel talked about the return to Europe, he was pointing to people who went out on the street. It was those people who caused the revolution in 1989. It wasn't people sitting in governments. And again, the power of reaching out to societies is fundamental. I think the challenge we face right now is how do you do that effectively when the Putin regime is ready to, come down hard on those types of efforts, has canceled many of them, is watching very carefully. You don't want to put people in danger, and has really cut off mechanisms of support that had existed in the past to try to build this third, track, if you will. So I think many in the West would like to know more about how to do that, but I think they would welcome thoughts on that. If Vladimir has views on it, it would be very helpful.
Yes, before I pass the floor to Vladimir, I would like to encourage our viewers, and we are broadcasted on YouTube, on PISM, Facebook and Twitter channels. Feel free to ask questions. There are special tools to do that. And Vladimir, the screen is yours, and the questions are yours again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to thank Professor Hamilton for that last part of his comments that he made, because it's not often that we hear this distinction voiced in the West between the Putin regime and Russian society. Too often, and I realize a lot of times people don't do this on purpose, they're doing without even thinking about this, but even on the level of language, we hear the leaders of Western democracies talk about Russian abuses, Russian behavior, let's punish Russia, let's do this. And, as if you can equate an entire nation of 140 million people with different views, different outlooks, including a great number of people who fundamentally disagree with this regime and everything it's doing. You can equate all of that diverse nation with a small, corrupt, authoritarian clique that has been sitting in the Kremlin for the past 20 years. And again, just as with that stereotype, Dr. Debsky, that you asked about a few minutes ago about, not Russians not being accustomed to democracy, just as with that one, this is also both offensive and not true. And it's very important that people in the West make that distinguish. It's not too difficult. It's not too difficult to say Kremlin or Putin's government or Putin's regime, whatever your term of preference is, but don't just say Russia, trying to paint everybody with the same brush. And that distinction is crucial, not just in words, but also in policy. And I think if we talk about the approach of Western democracies to Russia, or the regime in the Kremlin and society, those two should be at the two fundamentally different places on the pole. When it comes to the regime in the Kremlin, first of all, because I agree completely with Professor Hamilton, we cannot start talking about approach to Russian society without first talking about the approach to Kremlin regime. And by the way, a few minutes ago, we talked about how, I said about how I think, and I know many people share this view, Western leaders made a mistake of not reaching out enough to the democratic government in Russia in the 1990s. They made the opposite mistake after Mr. Putin came to power, and started reaching out and engaging as if Russia was still going on the path to democracy, whereas it was going already the opposite way. And we remember, again, and I know I speak for many of my colleagues in the Russian opposition here, we remember with just amazement and astonishment how, for example, the George W. Bush, the George Bush Jr., another American president, would look into Putin's eyes and get a sense of his soul. We'll remember that phrase. We remember when Barack Obama was president, he had a reset with the Kremlin and praised Putin for the great work he was doing on behalf of the Russian people. That's a direct quote. We hear today about invitations from the White House for Mr. Putin to attend, to come back into the G8 and to attend the summit in Washington. And this just has been completely astonishing. So it looks like almost as if, the leaders of Western democracy are doing in this regard exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time. Not enough integration and engagement with the democratic Russia in the 1990s, and a lot of engagement. And, in another historical era, this would have been called appeasement towards an authoritarian, non-democratic regime of Vladimir Putin. And so, if you watch Russian state television programs, those Kremlin propaganda channels, which, by the way, I don't advise you to do if you value your nervous system, but I have to sometimes just to see what they're saying. And of course, the consistent message on that side is that people like myself, my friends and colleagues in the Russian opposition, go to the West and we ask for money, or we ask for political support, or we ask for regime change in Russia, whatever other nonsense these people come up with. Of course, I don't need to tell you that none of that has anything to do with reality. The only thing we do ask, and it's only for Russian citizens and for Russian society to change the situation in Russia. It cannot and it should not be done by anyone from the outside. The only thing we do ask of the leaders of Western democracies is that they actually stand on their own values, is that they practice what they preach, and that they do not empower an authoritarian and corrupt regime of Vladimir Putin by, for example, doing this appeasement on a political level, or even more importantly, by allowing Kremlin cronies to use Western countries, Western banks, Western jurisdictions as havens to stash the money that they're stealing from the people of Russia. This is why the Magnitsky laws were so important. And I've had the honor of participating for more than a decade now in this campaign for accountability, for international accountability on human rights abusers in the form of targeted individual sanctions, visa bans and asset freezes on those people who, based on credible evidence, are personally complicit for gross human rights abuses or corruption. The brilliance of these sanctions is that they are targeted. You're not punishing an entire nation for the actions of a few crooks in the Kremlin. You go after them personally. That's the brilliance of it. It also makes it much more effective, because the whole raison d'etre of these people is that they want to steal in Russia, but then spend that money in the West. Spend vacations in the West, send their kids to schools in the West, send their wives and mistresses on shopping trips to the West, buy villas, yachts, and so on and so forth. And those targeted sanctions stop that. So I think it is it was very important, by the way, to see last week that the United Kingdom, which, as I don't need to tell you, has long been one of the favorite destinations for these people and their crooked money, the British government has finally begun to implement the Magnitsky legislation there. And there are now 6 countries in total who have this legislation on the books. And it's not just, by the way, about the sanctions and that aspect of accountability. It's also very important on the political level, frankly, to call things what they are. Professor Hamilton said a few minutes ago that it's important to keep the Kremlin accountable for violating international norms and the norms of international law. That relates, of course, to external aggression, Georgia, Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. It also relates to the violations of these international standards and international norms domestically, because Russia is a member of the Council of Europe. Russia is a member of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where the United States is a full member as well as every other European country. And those two organizations have, as one of the most fundamental tenets within them, the notion that human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and civil liberties cannot be constituted as quote unquote internal affairs of a state. You know, the favorite phrase from Putin's foreign ministry, don't meddle into our internal affairs. The OSCE Moscow document, I want to stress, it was actually signed in Moscow, states very clearly that matters relating to human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental freedoms do not constitute internal affairs of states, but instead are subject of international jurisdiction and international concern. And I think it's very important for our friends and partners and other member states of these organizations, both in the Council of Europe and in the OSCE, to actually speak out about this and to actually act on those norms and to hold the Kremlin regime accountable when it is violating them. I'll give you just two examples on this. You mentioned, Dr. Debsky, in your introduction, that I've been involved in the campaign of commemoration for my late friend and mentor Boris Nemtsov, and it has been successful in many cases. We have 4 world capitals have now commemorated Boris Nemtsov with street designations directly in front of Russian embassies now in Washington, Vilnius, Kiev, and most recently Prague. And by the way, there is a similar initiative happening in Warsaw. So I hope that Warsaw will be the next world capital to commemorate Boris Nemtsov with a street designation near the Russian embassy. And by the way, for me as a Russian citizen, as a Russian politician, I can think of nothing more pro-Russian than to name a street in front of the Russian embassy after a Russian statesman. And I know one day my country will be proud. But apart from the commemorations and the honoring of memory, we have also been engaged in very important procedures of oversight, both at the Council of Europe and at the OSCE, to try to not replace, because nothing can replace a genuine national investigation when the government doesn't want to hold one, but at least to have some sort of accountability when, after more than 5 years since the most brazen and the most high-profile political assassination in modern Russia, the organizers and masterminds remain unidentified and unindicted and fully shielded and protected by the highest levels of the Russian government. And so it's very important to see both the Council of Europe and the OSCE conduct oversight procedures and publish their reports into the Nemtsov case. Last year, the Council of Europe, earlier this year at the OSCE, at the winter meeting in February, with some very strong and very important conclusions. The second example I would give is something that happened just over a week ago, I guess almost 2 weeks ago now. On July 1st, we had a so-called plebiscite in Russia on a package of constitutional amendments proposed by Vladimir Putin, the most important of which, and in fact the real reason for the whole exercise, waives presidential term limits, allowing him to remain in power after the end of his current mandate in 2024. Vladimir Putin we can go on for a long time about everything he's done to dismantle democratic institutions and checks and balances in Russia. And so, in my mind, Vladimir Putin's regime has been illegitimate for a very long time. But it has been illegitimate de facto because it has been very careful, even while violating the spirit of the rule of law, to kind of pretend to stick to the letter, right? For example, we all remember the prearranged job swap with Dmitry Medvedev. I don't know if anybody still remembers that name, but believe it or not, it was actually the president of the Russian Federation, quote unquote, because that was the way Putin circumvented the term limit the first time. We all remember how elections were conducted. Again, I put elections in quotation marks, when Putin's opponents would be eliminated from the ballot ahead of time. It's not difficult to win an election when your opponents are not on the ballot. But again, formally speaking, there was an election, right? What happened on July 1st makes Putin's regime illegitimate, not only de facto, but also de jure as well. Because by simply throwing away, waiving, presidential term limits in a procedure that was patently fraudulent and sham, and there are dozens of conclusions and statements and reports about the so-called plebiscite that had nothing to do with a genuine democratic vote, Vladimir Putin finally confines himself and his regime to the rogue league of dictators such as, Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso, or Karimov in Uzbekistan, or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Lukashenko in Belarus, and many others who had used this trick before. And I think it's very important that this change is actually reflected in international policy, and that there are no more invitations to G8 summits. There are no more high-level visits. There is no more red carpet treatment, because this regime is now finally illegitimate, not only de facto, but also de jure. But at the same time, as conducting this principled policy towards the Putin regime, I think it's very important, as Professor Hamilton said a few minutes ago, to also have an outreach, direct and active outreach to Russian citizens and to Russian society, and to have that people-to-people dialogue, and to develop, instead of trying to destroy U.S. international broadcasting. To have, recently there was a piece by Victoria Newland, who served in both Bush and Obama administrations in foreign policy positions dealing with Russia and with Europe as a whole. She had this absolutely brilliant idea, for example, that having visa-free travel to the US for young Russians, for Russian students, for people from Russian regions, because there's no better way of countering propaganda and lies than by allowing people to see the truth, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's very important to have that two-track policy, a principled and firm stand on the Putin regime, and outreach and dialogue and cooperation with Russian citizens and Russian society.
Wonderful, Vladimir. We have 8 minutes to go, and we have 3 questions, all to you. First, from Eva Rosowska, our head of Public Information Office, who asked, under what political circumstances Russia could return to democracy? That very, big political question. Then Anna Diner, our analyst working both on Belarus and Russia, asked how the international society can help to support civil society in Russia. And Agnieszka Legutska, Professor Agnieszka Legutska, also analyst on Russia from PISM, asked about Magnitsky Acts. How you evaluate implementation of this legislation worldwide? And my last question to you is, should Polish Parliament consider introducing Magnitsky Law? Do you believe that Poland could play any role in this, in your campaign on Magnitsky legislation?
Thank you so much. Very important questions, all of them, and I've noted them all down. So the first one, I guess it's $1 million question, right? How can Russia return to democracy? And again, speaking more as a historian here, I think one of the things that Russian history definitely teaches us is that it is almost impossible to predict political change in Russia, how and when it's going to happen. And this includes people who actually participate in this change. I doubt very much that Vyacheslav von Plehve, who was the Tsarist interior minister when he boasted in 1904 about the need for a small victorious war that would solve all the domestic problems of the empire, the war with Japan he was referring to, of course. I don't think that he expected that just a year later, largely as a result of that war, Russia would be engulfed in a revolution, and the Tsar would be forced to grant civil political liberties and for the first time a parliament in Russia. In January of 1917, Vladimir Lenin was speaking to a group of young Swiss social democrats in Zurich, and he told them, that famous phrase, "My generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution." The revolution started in 6 weeks. And I'm old enough myself to remember August of 1991, when nobody at the beginning of the month could have predicted that by the end of the month, there would no longer be a Soviet regime. And by the end of the year, there would no longer be a Soviet Union itself. And that, one of the most repressive regimes in the history of humanity would collapse in 3 days. This is how things happen in Russia. So we believe as a responsible pro-democracy opposition that our job is to prepare. It's to lay the groundwork for that change that will come. Nothing is forever. Nothing is eternal. And Vladimir Putin is not an exception to that. And we have seen several times in the last few years, in the last decade or so, we have seen Russian citizens, Russian society show its muscles increasingly against this regime. Just remember the big pro-democracy protests in the winter of 2011 and 12, the wave of anti-corruption protests in 2017 and 18. Most recently, just last year, tens of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow after the government decided to bar, the most popular opposition candidates from the city elections and so on. And one day there will be enough people on the streets that the regime can simply not withstand. I mean, it's been clear for a very long time that in the system Vladimir Putin has created in Russia, political change will not come through the ballot box because we have no free and fair elections and haven't had them for a long time, but it will come through the streets. And one thing that is very difficult to say is when exactly that's going to happen. All I can say is that, of course, it's going to happen much sooner than 2036. It was quite amusing kind of to hear some analysts saying that now that Putin's got these changes through, he's going to stay in power, until 2036. Given the state of Russian public opinion, you know, the Moodin Russian Society. That's I have not met I've not actually met a single person, and that includes both supporters and opponents of the Putin regime, who seriously believe that he will be able to stay in power that long. Just to give you just one example, a recent Levada Center poll, and there are big caveats with measuring public opinion in an authoritarian state, where a lot of people are hesitant for obvious reasons to state their true opinion. But even with all these caveats, a recent poll by the Levada Center showed that public confidence in Putin in an open-ended poll plummeted to 25%. Down from more than 50% even 3 years ago. So with such trends, I don't see how it's possible for him to stay in power for as long as he wants. Change will come to the street, through the street. It won't come through the ballot box. And again, it's our job as a responsible opposition to make sure that it's as smooth, as peaceful, as velvet, if I can borrow that term from another Eastern European revolution, as possible. How can the international community help? We sort of partially addressed this question a few minutes ago. The main thing I think for the international community is not to help, but not to impede civil society in Russia by empowering and propping up and lending the prestige and legitimacy to the Putin regime to which it is not entitled and to which it has no claim. And so I think it's very important for the international community simply to stand on their own values and to state the obvious, you know, that Vladimir Putin's government has no longer any, not just democratic legitimacy, forget about that for a long time, but even any kind of formal legitimacy after the sham plebiscite extending his rule. And also not empower the Putin regime in a very literal sense by giving it a financial lifeline and by allowing its crooks and its cronies and its officials and its oligarchs to use Western countries and Western jurisdictions as havens for their looted wealth. And this is where we naturally come to the third and fourth questions on the Magnitsky Act. Boris Nemtsov has called the Magnitsky Act the most pro-Russian law, and I quote, the most pro-Russian law ever passed in a foreign country, because it individually targets the people who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. These are not general sanctions, these are targeted individual sanctions. And so it's a pro-Russian measure, and there's nothing that enrages the Kremlin more than the thought of losing this access to Western jurisdictions and to Western financial institutions. They've tried everything they could to stop the Magnitsky legislation, as well as their allies and lobbyists and friends in Western countries too, by the way. But thankfully, we're seeing that they are not succeeding, and that there are 6 countries as of today, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, that have enacted the Magnitsky legislation. The UK finally began implementing it last week. The problem was that until last week, only 5 of the 6 were actually implementing it. The UK started last week, and this was only the first step, and I'm very grateful to the British government for finally doing it. And of course, we want to see this law extended to other countries and other jurisdictions too. Just a few weeks ago, I was testifying at a hearing for the Australian Parliament, of course, in the same online format, because Australia is the next country that's seriously considering adopting such legislation. But I think the most, and I hope it becomes reality there soon, but of course, as I don't need to tell you, the most important jurisdiction to adopt such sanctions would be the European Union. For very obvious reasons, because that is by far the most attractive destination for these crooks and oligarchs in the Kremlin. We saw in December the European Council take the first step towards implementing this initiative. Now, of course, everything is slowed down now because of the pandemic, but hopefully once we finally come out of it, this will resume. And I hope and expect that both that the Polish Parliament, Dr. Debski, to address your question, will pass both a national Magnitsky legislation, because one doesn't preclude another, like the Baltic states are obviously members of the European Union. They all have their own national Magnitsky legislation as well. So I certainly hope that Poland's join in this growing chorus of accountability for human rights abusers. And I also hope that the Polish government uses its seat on the European Council and its voice in the European Union to push for this legislation, for this principle on the EU-wide level as well. Because after all it is ending the astonishing hypocrisy, the astonishing double standard, whereby for years, the people who have abused and attacked and violated the most basic norms of democracy in the rule of law in our country, in Russia, then come to your countries in the Western European Union and enjoy the privileges and the fruits and the benefits of democracy and the rule of law that your countries offer. It is massive hypocrisy on their part. It is enabling on the part of Western countries that allow such people and the dirty money in. And I hope that this hypocrisy and this enabling will soon come to an end.
Thank you very much. We are almost, exhausted our time, but there is one question from YouTube, our viewer, Maciej Pukowski, who asked how strong civil society in Russia is, in your view. In 1-2 sentences, Vladimir?
Of course, it is very resilient. What's very hopeful is that most of the active participants in civil society are young people, just like the protesters we saw on the streets last year and in the previous years. You know, as part of my work in the last few years, I've been almost everywhere across Russia, you know, from Kaliningrad to Irkutsk, I guess the most. I haven't made it to the Far East yet, that's ahead. But everywhere I go, you know, everywhere I speak, everywhere we hold public events and roundtables and discussions and film screenings and so on, I see, you know, active, engaged young people who understand perfectly everything that's happening in the country and who want to see change and who are ready to work for that change. And one final thing I would say, and that's very important as well in terms of the civil society around the country. And I don't know if this is true of Poland or not, but this certainly is true of our culture, at least previously. Up until a few years ago, it was possible to tell very clearly the difference between an audience, say in Moscow or St. Petersburg, so in the capital cities, and a provincial audience. You could know straight away whether you're speaking to people in those two cities, maybe a couple of other large cities, and people kind of in the Russia as a whole. That is still true of the older generation, but of I guess the generation of 30 and below, or maybe 35 and below, that is no longer true. That difference is evaporating. And I was a few weeks ago, before this quarantine began, I was in Syktyvkar in the Komi Republic, which is northern part of European Russia. Had a film screening and then kind of had a couple of hours of discussion. Many young people there in the audience. And I suddenly caught myself thinking that I can no longer tell the difference, that these could be students and young people. They could be in Moscow, they could be in Petersburg, they could be anywhere. And in this particular case, they were in the Republic of Komi, because, it's a generation that live in the same information space, regardless of where they live. They use the same, they read the same Twitter feeds, they watch the same YouTube videos, they live in the same kind of, social media realm. And so I think that's a very hopeful and promising sign for the future as well, especially for the young generation. That's the best hope for the future of Russia. It's that young generation that we're already seeing today.
Thank you very much. On behalf of both of us, me and Dan, I would like to thank you, Vladimir, very much for your contribution to our book. I would like to share the last comment. It's that, asking the question how we can help Russia to become a democratic country or Russian society. I think, providing platform for pro-democratic minds in Russia, that's the way how we can help. I cannot travel myself to Russia anymore. I was blacklisted, as you know. So yeah, we can meet only virtually, or
take it as a badge of honor. That's like a medal in the current conditions.
You'd be very welcome to Warsaw, to PISM, and one day I believe after pandemic, we would be very happy if you consider our invitation to come to speak, to make the case for Magnitsky Law in Poland, in the European Union. Make the case for a street to Boris Nemtsov. I had the honor to know him, so that's also a part of of my own history. So I would like to thank all our audience for being with us, for sharing their time. We had, I believe, fascinating discussion about the future, both of Russia and Europe. And I strongly believe that one day, if we work very hard on both sides, I mean, in Europe, in the United States, and in Russia, to make this vision, Europe whole and free, come really true. I mean, to materialize it in the way that Russia would become a full-fledged member of our democratic community. That's our common purpose, and I encourage all our audience to work in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to see all of you at our next conversation about Europe, whole and free, and our book. Thank you for that. Thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Honored to participate. Thank you.
Take care.